Section 3. Capitalism, Socialism, and the Corporate State. We begin with a quote from an article titled Fascism Calling to the Industrialists and Businessmen, printed in the Fascist Week, January 1934. Fascism differs from socialism chiefly in this, that in the corporate state, you will be left in possession of your business. Unquote. Fascism endeavors to present itself as a third alternative distinct from either capitalism or socialism. To the workers, fascism insists that it does not stand for capitalism. To the employers, fascism insists that it does not stand for socialism. For its supposed distinct positive conception, it remains extremely vague. Only after several years of existence, Italian fascism worked out the formula of the corporate state to cover its aim. German fascism worked out the formula of National Socialism. Both these formulas are intended to represent the supposed third way or third alternative to capitalism or socialism. This supposed third alternative, the will-o'-the-wisp dream of petty bourgeois ideology ever since the development of capitalism and the class struggle, remains a myth and can never be other than a myth. It is in fact nothing but a repetition of the old petty bourgeois dream of a class society without class contradictions or class struggle, but this time used to cover in reality the most violently coercive class state and class suppression. The corporate state is in fact the transparent masquerade dress of modern capitalism, with developed state organization of industry and complete suppression of all independent workers' organization and rights. Economically, there can only be capitalism or socialism in conditions of modern society based on large-scale industry. What is capitalism? Capitalism is marked by 1. Production for profit, 2. Class ownership of the means of production, 3. Employment of the dispossessed workers or proletariat for wages. What is socialism? Socialism is marked by 1. Common ownership of the means of production by the workers, constituting the entire society, 2. Production for use. The current fashionable vulgar talk of all bourgeois journalists and politicians about, quote, the disappearance nowadays of the line of distinction between capitalism and socialism is only based on the confusion that capitalism is identified with the old liberal laissez-faire relatively small-scale capitalism or individualism of the 19th century, while socialism is identified with state intervention, or when the government does stuff. Hence, the most typical characteristics of modern capitalism or imperialism, with the increasing role of the state in its organization, while still being capitalism, are described as, quote, socialism, while the realities of wage labor, profits, and class division are unchanged and even intensified. This muddle-headed confusion, which is common to all capitalist, laborist, and fascist ideology, and is the breeding ground for all the demagogic attempts of fascism to conceal its capitalist character, becomes impossible as soon as the class analysis of capitalism is understood. Fascism, by all the above tests, is economically identical with capitalism, representing only a special method to maintain its power and hold down the workers. Fascism is profit-making society. It is class society. It is society based on exploitation. Alike in Italy and in Germany, production is carried on for profit. The means of production are the property of a small minority, the upper strata of whom draw large incomes through their ownership. The mass of the workers are cut off from ownership, and they work for a wage, producing surplus value for the owners, or they are left unemployed if it's not profitable to employ them. All these are the familiar characteristics of capitalism in all countries, as are equally the crisis, depression, decline of production, and mass unemployment. The fascist countries show no difference from the other capitalist countries in any of these respects. Fascist Italy and fascist Germany are no better off than non-fascist France and non-fascist Britain. In fact, worse off, but for reasons not necessarily connected with fascism. They are all economically in the same boat, in the capitalist boat. The only contrast is provided by the land of socialist construction, the Soviet Union, with its ending of unemployment and gigantic rise of production alongside the decline in all fascist or other capitalist countries. It is necessary at the outset to insist on these very elementary facts before examining more closely the specific economic institutions of fascism, because fascist propaganda, which is characterized by brazenness of assertion rather than by any attempt at objective or scientific character, is so insistent on denying the capitalist basis of fascism that it may easily confuse those who mistake words for facts. as this plea is at the heart of the economic apologies for fascism, it will be necessary to examine more closely, first, the fascist line of expression on capitalism, second, the fascist line of expression on, quote, socialism, as exemplified in National Socialism, and finally, the positive economic principles and practice of fascism, as exemplified in the corporate state or in the German labor code. The fascist line of expression on capitalism is marked by extreme self-contradiction. According to Hitler, there is no such thing as the, quote, capitalist system. He writes, or someone writes in his name, quote, there does not exist a capitalist system. The employers have worked their way up to the top by their industry and efficiency, and by virtue of this selection, which shows that they belong to a higher type, they have the right to lead. Every leader of industry will forbid any interference by a factory council, unquote. According to Mussolini, however, in his speech to the Council of Corporations on November 14, 1933, the present crisis is, quote, a general crisis of capitalism. He defines capitalism as follows, quote, capitalism in its most highly developed form is a mass production for mass consumption, financed nationally and internationally by anonymous capital, unquote. Having thus brilliantly defined capitalism in terms of capital, he is compelled to tie himself up this way, for if he were to attempt to analyze capital, he would be compelled to lay bare the capitalist basis of fascism. Mussolini proceeds to distinguish three periods of capitalism. The period of free competition from 1830 to 1870, the static or stagnating period of the Great Trusts from 1870 to 1913, and the period of decadence since the war. Here we have only a very confused and mangled borrowing from Lenin's imperialism. He then poses the question, quote, the crisis which has held us in its clutches for 4 years, is it a crisis in the capitalist system or of the capitalist system, unquote. And Mussolini reaches the answer that the crisis which has held us, fascist Italy, in its clutches for 4 years is, quote, a crisis of the capitalist system, which Hitler says does not exist. But having reached this important admission, he then endeavors to argue that Italy is, quote, not a capitalist country. Upon what does he base this argument? It's on the plea that in Italy there is a majority proportion of agriculture and small industry, as if this made any difference to the dominance of the capitalist class and of capitalist exploitation, which knows very well how to suck the labors, not only of the industrial workers, but also of the peasants and small producers. But if this structure makes Italy not capitalist, this structure applied equally to Italy before fascism, and Italy was then accordingly not capitalist also before fascism. But if Italy was not capitalist before fascism, what was it? Again, he can give no answer which would not undermine his whole attempt to present fascist Italy as any different in its essential capitalist basis from pre-fascist Italy. Finally, he argues that since the corporate system has admittedly failed to save Italy from the crisis of capitalism, quote, which has held us in its clutches for 4 years, therefore the corporate system may be recommended to other capitalist countries to save them equally, quote, we come to the last question. Can the corporative principle be applied in other countries? There's no doubt about it. As there is a general crisis of capitalism, solution by the corporate state seems to be necessary in other countries, unquote. However, in that case, he would need to show that solution by the corporate state has applied to Italy, which has suffered as heavily from the capitalist crisis as any other capitalist country. But when the crisis broke on Italy in 1929 and 30, what was his line? Did he argue that solution by the corporate state would save Italy? On the contrary, he argued that fascist Italy was helpless to do any more about the crisis than any other capitalist country. In his speech of October 1st, 1930, Mussolini declared, quote, the situation has grown considerably worse throughout the world, including Italy. The state cannot perform miracles. Not even Mr. Hoover, the most powerful man in the world and the richest country in the world, has succeeded in putting his house in order, unquote. So, the state, i.e. the fascist state, cannot perform miracles. It cannot hope to do more than other capitalist countries. Quite right, and very honestly said for once. But in that case, what happens to the boasted superiority of fascism and the supposed emancipation of fascism from capitalism and its contradictions? And commenting, I thought that the state was absolute, so why can't it perform miracles? What is the cause of the crisis in Mussolini's understanding such that the state can't fix it, etc.? Continuing, it is evident that we have here a mere tangle of confusions and self-contradictions, which could be endlessly further exemplified from the statements of all the principal fascist leaders in all countries, without attempt at serious thinking. Let us now turn to the fascist line on socialism. According to Mussolini, in his speech on January 13, 1934, quote, "Socialism is condemned outright as, quote, the bureaucratization of economy." According to German fascism, socialism is the ideal, provided that it is, quote, national socialism. But what do they mean by socialism? The definitions given by the leaders of German fascism afford an instructive variety of choice. The 13th point of the official party program calls for the, quote, nationalization of all trusts. However, the official economic theorist of the party, Feder, explains in his manifesto on the suppression of interest slavery, quote, "Every honest politician knows that general socialization means economic collapse, and the absolute bankruptcy of the state. Our watchword must not be socialization, but desocialization," unquote. Goebbels, in his little ABC of the National Socialists, states, quote, "The socialization of all the means of production is absolutely unachievable," unquote. Addressing a group of businessmen at Hamburg on December 15, 1933, Feder won their applause by declaring that, quote, "The state must not engage in business itself as a competitor," and then added, "Don't be afraid that your enterprises will be nationalized." Where then is the, quote, socialism? Explanations are forthcoming in abundance. Gregor Strasser, speaking on the radio on behalf of the party on June 14, 1932, gave the following comprehensive definition, quote, "By socialism, we understand governmental measures for the protection of the individual or the group against any sort of exploitation, the taking over of the railways by the state, of the streetcars, power plants, and gasworks by the municipalities, the emancipation of the peasants by Baron von Stein, and the incorporation of the guild system into the state, the Prussian officers' system of selection by achievement, the incorruptibility of the German official, the old walls, the town hall, the cathedral of the free imperial city. These are all expressions of German socialism as we conceive and demand it," unquote. Socialism, then, after passing gently through the stages of gas and water Fabianism and an admixture of guilds, thus comes to rest at last in the solid ground of the old walls, the cathedral, and the Prussian officers' system. Goebbels is still more explicit in his brochure, "Prussia Must Become Prussian Again." Quote, "Socialism is Prussianism. The conception Prussianism is identical with what we mean by socialism," unquote. And again, in a speech in East Prussia, quote, "Our socialism is that which animated the kings of Prussia." This is really reminding me of that infracell, claiming the Ming Dynasty was socialist, etc. Anyway, and which reflected itself in the march step of the Prussian grenadier regiments, a socialism of duty, unquote. The hell is a socialism of duty? It is impossible not to recall Marx's comments on German socialism, despite all the differences, nearly a century ago. Quote, "German socialism recognized its own calling as the bombastic representative of the petty bourgeois Philistine. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German petty bourgeois Philistine to be the typical man. To every typical meanness of this model man, it gave a hidden, higher, socialist interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to the length of directly opposing the, quote, brutally destructive tendency of communism, and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles," unquote. But this old German socialism, which Marx thus castigated, was by comparison the noblest-hearted idealism if set against the conscious and open filth of their German socialist descendants of the 20th century, the bootlickers of reaction and murderers of the workers, dressing up the hated Prussian, militarist, absolutist corpse as, quote, socialism. It is obvious that the fascist conceptions on socialism are even less worthy of serious discussion than are their conceptions on capitalism. It remains to consider their supposed new and distinctive program, the corporate state, quote, "the greatest constructive conception yet devised by the mind of man," according to Mosley. What is the corporate state? The basic official document of principles, the Italian Labor Charter, published in 1927, lays down the following in Section 7, quote, "The corporate state considers that in the sphere of production, private initiative is the most effective and valuable instrument in the interests of the nation. Since private enterprise is a function of national concern, the organizer of the enterprise is responsible to the state for the management of its production. from the fact that the elements of production, labor, and capital are cooperators in a common enterprise. Reciprocal rights and duties devolve upon them. The employee, whether laborer, clerk, or skilled workman, is an active collaborator in the economic enterprise, without significant, if any, equity in that enterprise, responsibility for the direction of which rests with the employer, unquote. These principles are tolerably familiar in all capitalist countries. The standard semi-official work on the question, Fausto Piliani's The Italian Corporative State, written in 1933 in, quote, close contact with the Ministry of Corporations, declares, quote, the idea of the sovereignty of the state and of national unity is the primary motive underlying the fascist theory of government. Parallel to this unifying principle, there is to be noted another concept implicit in the state system which fascism desires to build up, namely, the economic collaboration of the various categories engaged in production. This new economic departure may be said to lie somewhere between liberalism and communism. The different categories of producers are represented officially by various occupational associations. These occupational associations, consisting solely of employers, or of workers, or of persons belonging to one or other of the liberal professions, are grouped in corporations for purposes of protection and development of some specific branch of production. These advisory bodies are organs of state, and they embody all the elements involved in a given branch of production, namely, capital, labor, and technical direction. It is precisely from the character of these institutions, so distinctive a feature of the new political and economic order in Italy, that the epithet of corporative is derived, which serves to differentiate the fascist state in its particular characteristics from other state types, unquote. Paul Einzig, in his Pro-Fascist Economic Foundations of Fascism, 1933, describes the corporate state as a, quote, new economic system that differs fundamentally from liberal capitalism and communism. Quote, in the corporate state, private property is respected just as in any capitalist country. There is no expropriation without compensation. The state reserves the right, however, to limit and guide the employment of the means of production, and to intervene in the process of distribution in accordance with public interest. It does not aim at owning the means of production any more than in a capitalist country. Private ownership is the rule, and state ownership the exception. Sounds just like any capitalist country. But the government reserves the right to supplement individual initiative whenever this is considered necessary, to prevent it from developing in directions detrimental to the public interest, and to guide it so as to obtain the maximum benefit for the community as a whole, unquote. Now that is very vague. Mosley, in his Fascism in Britain, describes the corporate state as follows, quote, our policy is the establishment of the corporate state. As the name implies, this means a state organized like the human body. Every member of that body acts in harmony with the purpose of the whole under the guidance and driving brain of the fascist government. This does not mean that industry will be conducted or interfered with from Whitehall, as in socialist organization, but it does mean that limits within which interests may operate will be laid down by government, and that those interests will be the welfare of the nation as a whole. To that interest of the nation as a whole, all lesser interests are subordinate, whether of right or of left, whether they be employers' federation, trade union, banking, or professional interests. All such interests are woven into the permanently functioning machinery of corporate government. Within the corporate structure, interests such as trade unions and employers' federations will no longer be the general staffs of opposing armies, but the joint directors of national enterprise. Oh, interesting. I assume then that they're going to have equal amounts of power and compensation? Class war will give place to national cooperation, as if by magic, and not massive violence. All who pursue a sectional and anti-national policy will be opposed by the might of the organized state. There it is. Profit can be made, provided that the activity enriches the nation as well as the individual. Profit may not be made at the expense of the nation and of the working class. This is typical of any dictatorship of the bourgeoisie seeking to preserve its class rule. The corporate state will secure that the nation and the workers who are part of the nation will share fully in the benefits and rewards of industry. Define fully, unquote. The corporations, it should be noted, are, quote, advisory bodies. Control rests with the private employer in his enterprise and with the state above him, as in all capitalist countries. The corporations are joint committees of employers' representatives and so-called workers' representatives, after the destruction of all independent workers' organization. Only the workers' organizations recognized by the fascist state, not those chosen by the workers, are admitted. The only legal requirement being that they should represent 1/10 of the workers in an industry to secure sole recognition as representing all the workers in the industry. The functions of the corporations, according to Article 44 of the Decree of July 1st, 1926, are 1. Conciliation, 2. Encouragement of measures to, quote, coordinate production and improve its organization, 3. Establishment of labor exchanges, 4. Regulation of training and apprenticeship. The purely nominal stage-dressing character of the corporations is shown by the fact that up to 1933, 11 years after the establishment of the fascist regime, not a single corporation had yet been established, except for the amusement, quote, industry in 1930. Quoting H.W. Schneider, Making the Fascist State, 1928, the work will be done directly by the Minister of Corporations, and hence these largely nominal bodies will not be merely organs of the state, as the theory demands, but really mere additional powers for present politicians. As a result, not a single corporation has been formally created." Unquote. In 1933, Pitigliani, in his semi-official work already quoted, in the 4th chapter on corporative organization, coming to his 3rd section under the grandiose title, "The Corporations in Their Actual Working," is compelled to write under that title, like the famous chapter on snakes in Iceland, quote, "It is impossible to judge in the light of any practical results how the system is actually working in the corporative field properly so called. Reference has already been made to the fact that only a single corporation, viz. That of the stage, has so far been established in Italy." Unquote. Not until February 1934 was the law on the Constitution and functions of the corporations passed. On November 10, 1934, the 22 corporations were inaugurated. On this occasion, Mussolini declared, quote, "It is as yet premature to say what developments the corporative system may have in Italy and elsewhere from the point of view of the production and distribution of goods. Ours is a point of departure and not of arrival. Yet, since fascist corporativism represents the social content of the revolution, it categorically obliges all men of the regime, wherever and however they are organized, to guarantee its development and fruitful continuance." Unquote. The vagueness of this language is worthy of a MacDonald. What then does the corporate state, as so far described in the terms of its own advocates, actually represent? Its principles, according to these descriptions, amount in fact to the following. 1. Maintenance of the class structure of society and of class exploitation, under cover of phrases about organic unity, etc. 2. Maintenance of capitalist ownership, private enterprise, profits, etc. 3. Moderate state intervention or regulatory role where necessary. 4. Compulsory conciliation committees or joint industrial councils of capital and labor. But so far, this is identical with the principles of all modern capitalist states. The cool effrontery of attempting to present this as something new is only based on the naive trick of making the comparison with the long ago defunct, pre-imperialist, laissez-faire capitalist epoch. There's also a footnote regarding the organic unity, etc. The transparent deception, which is at the root of the corporate state, of maintaining class division in fact and denying it in words, is strikingly expressed by Rossoni, writing as president of the National Confederation of Fascist Syndicates on the significance of fascist syndicalism in the Yearbook of Fascist Studies, 1928. Quote, "The conception of fascist syndicalism changes the outlook of all those engaged in industry, and takes from socialism all that it has of value. Even the old terminology of masters and men is changing. The word master has an offensive meaning and implies the servitude of labor, a servitude which is in direct contradiction to modern progress." Comment, no argument there, but what makes labor labor is the fact that it doesn't control industry. And so materially, until classes are abolished, you can play whatever word games you like with calling the bourgeoisie or the capitalists some other thing, not master if you find that offensive, but that servitude of labor is a real thing. It's expressed in the property relations of capitalism. Unless you change those, then labor is, in fact, in servitude. Continuing, the Italian scheme of corporations brings about a much-needed cooperation between the directors and the executors of an undertaking, and is the only present-day conception which entails equilibrium and economic justice. Comment, no, that would be socialism, and also there is no lasting equilibrium or economic justice that can be achieved in class society. Continuing, It should be emphasized that it was these very fascist organizers who were the first to insist that the old expressions master and men should be abolished, and this is because master supposes servant. Comment: I mean, you can work at a grocery store where they're going to call you an associate. It doesn't mean you have any power or equity in the company that is worth anything. Continuing, nowadays we are no longer able to concur with the old absurd idea of class distinctions. Okay, but you're literally for upholding class distinctions. So then your own position is absurd if you're calling that idea absurd because you're upholding it. So that's just self-contradictory right off the bat. Anyway, nor do we hold that there is by nature any moral inferiority between men. On the contrary, it is fully recognized that all men have the same right to citizenship in the national life, unquote. Not really the question. It will be seen that the absurd idea of class distinctions is regarded as solely a question of terminology. Hence, while socialism aims at overcoming the class division of society by the abolition of classes, and thus achieving for the first time real social unity, fascism proposes a verbal liquidation of classes, while the reality remains. Employers and wage earners remain. The whole system of profits and exploitation remains, but these are to be covered by the new terms directors and executors of an undertaking, or, in the German labor code, leaders and followers, and therefore it is assumed that the class struggle should end. This is typical of the idealist outlook of fascism, or to speak more frankly, of its humbug. Back to the main text. Ever since the imperialist epoch, all modern capitalism has developed increasing state regulation and control, coordination and cartelization under state guidance, and 100,000 experiments and devices in joint industrial councils and every other possible mechanism for the collaboration of capital and labor. As for the conception of industry as a public service, and the approval of profit-making only insofar as it is consistent with national welfare, it really does not need a fascist, quote, revolution in order to be able to repeat the wisdom of a Callisthenes, who said this over 2,000 years ago. The practical meaning of the fascist revolution and its corporate state lies elsewhere, as we shall shortly see. Take, for example, pre-fascist Germany, where the state already held in its hands 1/10 of industrial production, held the dominating shares in the big banks, in shipping, and in the steel trust, and where industry and capital-labor relations were covered by a network of regulating councils. C.B. Hoover writes in his book already quoted, quote, "Cartelization had been carried to further limits than in any other country. In 1932, there were some 3,000 of these cartels. In the coal and potassium mining industry, syndication was compulsory, and complicated regulating councils known as the Federal Coal Council and the Federal Potassium Council had been set up. Upon these councils, the operators, laborers, consumers, and coal merchants were represented. There was a Federal Economic Council, but its regulatory functions had failed to develop," unquote. This Federal Coal Council, based on compulsory syndication, representing employers, workers, consumers, and coal merchants, with wide regulatory powers, was already a very much more developed corporation than anything produced by fascism. But this was only an advanced example of the tendency of modern capitalist development throughout the world. Here, fascism brings nothing new. Quote, "The idea of a national council," writes Mosley in his Greater Britain, with the complacency of an infant peacock, quote, "was, I believe, first advanced in my speech on resignation from the Labour government in May 1930. The idea has since been developed by Sir Arthur Salter and other writers," unquote. The history of capitalism since the war is littered with the idea of a national council, i.e. the National Economic Council or National Council of Industry in every country. Clemenceau, in 1918, proposed the formation of a National Economic Council, and the proposal only broke down on the opposition of the Confederation of Labor. Rathenau, in his new proposals for state organization, put in the center the formation of a representative state economic council. Millerand, in 1920, proposed the incorporation of a National Economic Council, including representatives of the trade unions in the state. Caillot made the same proposal in his Where is France Going? Where is Europe Going? The National Industrial Conference in Britain in 1919 put forward similar proposals for the establishment of a permanent representative National Industrial Council. The whole trend of post-war liberalism, laborism, and social democracy in particular is closely parallel to the fascist line and propaganda of the corporate state, i.e. the general line of combination of state control and private enterprise, coordination through a network of regulating councils, class collaboration, and so-called workers' representation. In short, the whole myth of organized capitalism. The great part of the liberal Yellow Book, of Labor and the Nation, and of the fascist Labor Charter could be interchanged without noticeable difference. Nevertheless, there is a, quote, new and distinct feature in the fascist corporate state. All the liberal labor proposals are based on the incorporation of the existing workers' organizations into the capitalist state, with the maintenance of the formal independent rights of organization and the right to strike. The fascist policy of the corporate state is based on the violent destruction of the workers' independent organizations and the complete abolition of the right to strike. This is the sole new feature of the fascist corporate state, to which modern capitalism elsewhere has not yet dared to advance, although developing in this direction as rapidly as it is able. The Italian Law of Syndicates of April 3, 1926, the basis of the corporate state, lays down in Article 18, quote, employees and laborers who in groups of 3 or more cease work by agreement, or who work in such a manner as to disturb its continuity or regularity, in order to compel the employers to change the existing contract, are punishable by a fine from 100 to 1,000 lire. The chiefs, promoters, and organizers of the crimes mentioned above are punishable by imprisonment for not less than 1 year, nor more than 2 years, in addition to the fines prescribed above. Unquote. Here is the real heart of the fascist corporate state. All the rest is window dressing. The meaning of this is expressed with simple delight by the financial publicist Einzig in his Economic Foundations of Fascism, a book written for the business public. Quote, strikes and lockouts were outlawed from the very outset of the fascist regime. In no country was it so easy as in Italy to obtain the consent of employees to a reduction in wages. Thanks to the establishment of industrial peace, wages in Italy are more elastic than in any other country. Unquote. In no country was it so easy to obtain a reduction in wages. That is the essence of the corporate state. Similarly, Augusto Turati, General Secretary of the Fascist Party, wrote in 1928, quote, the year 1927 was one of widespread economic depression. It was necessary for the government of the Fascist Party to take steps with the object of bringing about a general reduction of wages from 10 to 20%. It was then that the Labor Charter showed itself to be the one secure point of reference in the negotiations which followed. In the ungrateful task of reducing wages, not one of the principles, solemnly enunciated in the Labor Charter, was violated. Unquote. And the prominent fascist trade union official, Olivetti, declared at the Fascist Trades Union Congress in 1928, quote, it was an illusion to presume that the existence of class war had been finally abolished. It has been abolished for the workers. On the other side, class war is being continued. Unquote. The German Labor Code, brought into force on May 1, 1934, reveals the same picture. Its essence is the wiping out of all the collective contracts which have hitherto regulated German industry, and the establishment of the absolute power of the employer, called the, quote, leader of the factory, over his workers, called followers. Quote, in the factory, the employer, as the leader of the factory, and the workers and clerical employees as his followers, work jointly to further the aims of the factory in the joint interests of the people and of the state. The decision of the leader of the factory is binding on his followers in all factory matters. Unquote. In place of the previous elected works councils, the new factory councils are to be appointed by the employer in agreement with the Nazi leader in the factory, and to meet only when called by the employer. All collective agreements for industries or trades as a whole, or even for districts, are annulled. Wages are to be fixed separately by each firm according to the conditions of, quote, profitableness. The final word rests with the labor trustees, or district dictators, on all questions of wages and labor conditions. These are appointed by the Nazi government. The character of these labor trustees can be judged from the fact that the big industrialist, Krupp, has been appointed labor trustee for the Ruhr area. The destruction of all independent workers' organization, the complete slave subjection of the workers to the employers, the abolition of the right to strike, and intensified exploitation. This is the sole and entire reality of the corporate state for the working class. Section 4. The outcome of fascism in the economic sphere. Quoting from a 1930 speech by Mussolini, fortunately the Italian people is not yet accustomed to eating several times a day. Its standard of living is so low that it feels scarcity and suffering less. Unquote. Fortunately, he said. The principal reasoned claim put forward by fascism on its own behalf, on the rare occasions when it descends from emotional chauvinist and spiritual verbiage to endeavor to make a reasoned claim, is that fascism provides a solution of the economic crisis of modern capitalist society, and ensures economic harmony, prosperity, and progress. Fascism in its propaganda promises the solution of unemployment, rising production and consumption, higher wages, higher profits, and in general the end of all the contradictions of capitalism without ending capitalism. And comment, you can find a very similar description in the Communist Manifesto under bourgeois socialism. Continuing. The decisive test of this claim is the test of facts. The facts of the economic situation in every country where fascism rules. And above all, in Italy, the land of the corporate state, where the fascist regime has had 12 years to show its results. That the world crisis of capitalism has hit Italy as hard as any other capitalist country, with colossal unemployment, falling production and trade, and lowered wages, so that fascism has brought no immunity whatever from the common ills of capitalism. Even the official apologists of fascism are compelled to admit. But in fact, the economic crisis hit Italy before the world crisis, while the rest of the capitalist world was enjoying a boom, and then became further intensified by the world crisis. The pro-fascist Einzig writes in his Economic Foundations of Fascism, quote, "Between 1926 and 1930, the depression prevailing in Italy presented a discouraging contrast with the prosperity of most other countries. But that prosperity has since been proved to be fictitious, so that we are now in a position to say that Italy has missed little by failing to share it." Okay. Moreover, during her period of depression, Italy became hardened to face the subsequent crisis, unquote. Now that's funny. Depressions are good for you. They toughen you up. If this is the best that a supporter of fascism on economic grounds can claim, it is scarcely an advertisement. The only consolation for the failure of Italy under fascism to share in even the limited upward movement of other capitalist countries between 1926 and 30 is found in the fact that, in consequence, even the world crisis could hardly make things much worse than they were already in Italy. According to the League of Nations World Economic Survey 1932-3, the national income in Italy fell from 94 billion lire in 1928 to 60 to 70 billion lire in 1931, or a drop of one-third. In the same period in the Soviet Union, according to the same authority, the total income rose from 18.6 billion gold rubles to 31.2 billions, or an increase by two-thirds. And commenting, the obvious explanation is that those dirty commies stole the fascists' wealth. Continuing, foreign trade in 1932 was less than half the volume of 1930, and the tonnage of goods cleared at the ports in 1932 was actually less than in 1913, when the population was 6 million fewer. That was sarcastic, that last comment, by the way. Italy keeps no general index of production, but the production of pig iron, which was 603,000 tons in 1913, was 461,000 tons in 1932. The production of steel was raised to 2.1 million tons in 1929, but it fell to 1.4 millions in 1932. 1933 saw a slight upward movement, as in other countries, but foreign trade continued to fall, from 15.1 million lire in 1932 to 13.3 million in 1933. The budget deficit rose from 504 million lire in 1930 to 31 to almost 3.7 billion in 1932 to 3. The floating debt rose from 1.6 billion lire in June 1928 to 8.9 billion in June 1933. Bankruptcies in 1931 reached the record in Europe, exceeding 21,000, or 5 times the British total. The unemployment record is still more revealing. The total of industrial and commercial wage earners was returned in 1933 at just under 4.3 million, or about 1/4 of the British total. Yet, the official return of wholly unemployed for 1933, monthly average, stood at 1 million, and in January 1934, the latest return available at the time of this writing, stood at 1.16 million, in addition to about 250,000 returned as partially or seasonally unemployed. As for unemployment insurance, quote, "The amount of unemployment insurance is moderate, even for the low standard of living prevailing, and it is paid only for a short period," unquote. It's quoting from Einzig. For 40 weeks contributions, only 3 months benefit is paid, at a maximum of 3.75 lire. There is no transitional benefit. In December 1931, of 982,321 registered unemployed, only 195,454 were receiving benefit. Between 1919 and 1929, the unemployment fund received 1.275 million lire in contributions from the employers and workers, the state contributing nothing, and paid out only 413 millions in benefits, and the state constantly raiding the fund for its own purposes. Truly a halcyon state of affairs from the capitalist point of view, at which even the skinflints of the national government might look with despairing envy. It may be noted that the social services expenditure in Italy is among the lowest of any leading country in Europe, amounting to 3% of the total national budget, as against 7% in Belgium or 9% in Britain. So comment, this is another key feature of fascism, austerity. The wage-cutting record gives the final stamp on the realities of fascist economics. Between 1929 and 32, the total payroll of wages and salaries fell from 6 billion lire to 4.1 billion. In the same period, according to a report of the director of the International Labor Office in June 1933, quote, the purchasing power of the wage earners fell by 19%, unquote. Cuts had been heavy already before the world crisis, quote, between June 1927 and December 1928, wages fell by about 20% as a result of agreements between masters and men in connection with the stabilization of the lira. A further drop of approximately 10% took place in 1929, and in November 1930 there was a general downward movement, in some cases not exceeding 18%, but in particular instances involving as much as 25%. Moreover, we must not overlook the fact that many other adjustments were made in 1931. Unquote. And that's quoting Biaggi, the Secretary of the National Confederation of Fascist Syndicates, 1932. This makes successive cuts, first of 20%, then of 10%, then of 18 to 25%, in addition to, quote, many other adjustments. The Department of Overseas Trade Report on Economic Conditions in Italy, 1933, states, quote, while the cost of living with an index figure of 93.78 in 1927 has fallen in 1932 to 78.05, a difference of 15.73%, industrial wages have been reduced by much larger proportions. Cuts have been made ranging from 16 to 18% in the sheltered printing and woodworking trades, 25% in the metal and chemical industries, to 40% in the cotton industry. To the above must be added arbitrary reductions effected by various means without negotiation, such as the regrading of work staff and the systematic reduction of piecework rates. Unquote. Examples are given of the percentage cuts in the various industries. Chemicals, 20 to 25%, rayon, 20%, rayon in Turin, 38%, glass, 30 to 40%, cotton, 40%, wool, 27%, silk weaving, 38%, jute, 30%, metal trades, 23%, building, 30%, mining, 30%. This process has been carried still further with the extensive all-around wages and salaries cuts proclaimed by government order in April 1934. The importance of the fascist corporate system, making strikes a penal offense, is obvious. If we turn to Germany, it's clear that 1 year's experience is not yet sufficient to achieve the imposing completeness of the Italian results in depressing the conditions of the workers and spreading poverty, but the signs of the direction are already abundant. Foreign trade in 1933 fell by 13% in comparison with 1932, exports by 16%, and the export surplus by 40%. The volume of production rose by 12%, but this rise was mainly in industries, iron and steel, dyes and chemicals, artificial silk, electrotechnical, and motors, connected with war needs, and was actually accompanied, as will be seen, by a fall in the general standard of living. The rise in output was not accompanied by any rise in the total payroll until the third quarter. Quote, this means that fresh employment was only found at the expense of those already occupied by cutting down their hours of work and reducing their wages accordingly. Quoting The Economist, December 30, 1933. Retail sales, the measure of internal trade and of the standard of living, fell heavily, even compared with the low level of 1932. Quoting the New York Analyst, January 1934, retail sales of the first 10 months of 1933 were 8% below those of the very depressed corresponding period of 1932. Department store sales declining 20% on a like comparison, and later reports indicate substantial further decline. Unquote. This reflects a lowered standard of life. The German Institute for Economic Research reported a decline of 10% in the consumption of the principal foodstuffs during the first and second quarters of 1933, in some articles of even 30%, and, quote, stabilization at this lower level in the third quarter. For the whole of 1933, it reported a decline of 7% in the turnover of retail commodities, compared with 1932. Prices rose steadily, especially of foodstuffs, through special legislation, e.g. the fat monopoly and the raising of the price of margarine by 175%, the raising of the price of wheat to 182 marks per ton, or 4 times the world price, etc. Nazi propaganda tries to make much of the rise in the volume of production by 12% during 1933, and of the decline in the official figure of registered unemployed by 2 millions on the previous 6 millions, actually 1.7 millions, from 5.8 million in December 1932 to 4.1 million in December 1933. Both claims are misleading. The rise in production was, as explained, in great part connected with the war industries. It was not a rise peculiar to Germany, but was part of a world movement during the same period. Between January and December 1933, the German Index of Industrial Production, on the basis of 1928 as 100, rose from 62.9 to 72.8. The United States Index from 58.6 to 67.6, the French from 78.7 to 83.5, the Japanese from 117.2 to 139.4 November, the Canadian from 52.8 to 72.2, the Swedish from 83.7 to 97.1, that is according to the League of Nations Monthly Bulletin of Statistics, March 1934. The figures in the alleged decline in unemployment are still more misleading. The official figure is given of a decline in the registered unemployed from 6 million in January 1933 to 3.7 million in November 1933, and to 2.8 million in March 1934. But the total of employed workers in November 1933, according to the health insurance statistics, was 14 million, making with the 3.8 million registered unemployed a combined total of 17.7 million workers. In August 1929, that is before the crisis, the same combined total of employed and unemployed workers numbered 20.4 million. Thus, since 1929, 2.3 million workers have dropped clean out of the German official statistics, being neither entered as employed nor as unemployed, alongside an increase in overall population. Quote, the actual number of unemployed is admitted to be considerably larger than the number registered. The invisible unemployed are now reckoned at about 1.5 million. This is quoting the Manchester Guardian Weekly, January 1934. Quote, most signs tend to show that the volume of unrecorded unemployment has increased, quoting The Economist, March 1934. This contradiction was strikingly brought out when, in March 1934, the official figure for unemployment was returned at 2.8 million, and in the very same month, Hitler, momentarily forgetful of the official figure, in his speech at Munich on March 21st, spoke of the necessity during the coming year to endeavor to bring into employment 5 million of those at present unemployed. The official decline in registered unemployed in fact reflects a series of factors. Married women have been driven out of industry without being registered as unemployed, consequent on the Nazi law forbidding the employment of married women where their husbands are employed, and thus they disappear from the official records. The same applies to the prisoners in concentration camps and to the Jewish and political refugees. Several hundreds of thousands of workers, estimated at 680,000, according to Basel Rundschau, November 18, 1933, have been drafted into the militarized labor camps, agricultural service, and other work schemes, and are thus counted as employed, but in fact they receive no normal wage, but either only food and a few marks a week, or a very low subsistence allowance, equivalent to unemployment relief. Finally, throughout industry, by a series of devices offering inducements for this process to employers, workers have been given part-time work by spreading existing work with reduced hours and weekly wages, that is, at the expense of other workers and of a general lowering of standards. On the whole process, the British financial journal, The Statist, comments, with reference to Hitler's anniversary speech to the Reichstag, quote, as regard economic affairs, he had not very much to say, perhaps because there is not much to report. He claimed, as the figures show, a reduction in unemployment of 2.5 millions to about 3.7 millions. But this is obviously not a reliable guide to the trend of industrial conditions, since, apart from labor immobilization in labor camps and concentration camps, the effect of the tax certificate system has been to spread employment out over the work available rather than to succeed in creating new work. There has, however, been some improvement in production, particularly in iron and steel in 1933 as compared with 1932, and doubtless this has meant some real decrease in unemployment. The improvement in employment is therefore only partly due to a net increase in the demand for labor, and it arises mainly from spreading out employment. This may be a good thing psychologically, but economically it results in lower wages and even in lower real wages. In addition to this lowering of the standard of living, there must be counted the numerous, quote, voluntary contributions which have to be deducted from the weekly wages. It is possible, as a result, that the beneficial political effect of spreading employment may be lost in the lowering of the standard of living, and probably for this reason, Herr Hitler did not devote much of his speech to economic affairs, unquote. This process of effective wage reduction and lowering of the standard of living, already revealed in the statistics of falling consumption during 1933, is further borne out by the available information on the movement of wages. The official statistics claim that the total of wages plus salaries for the third quarter of 1933 exceeded the corresponding total for 1932 by 4%, alongside an increase in the number employed by 7%. It is obvious that even these figures, which do not take into account the heavily increased deductions from wages, nevertheless betray a net reduction in the wage per worker. It may be noted that the total return from the tax on wages, which reached 65 million marks for the monthly average in 1932, fell to 61.3 millions in July 1933, and 59.6 millions in August 1933, the very period of the supposed increase. A correspondent in the Manchester Guardian reports, quote, wages fell considerably in Germany in 1932, and there was a further fall last year. At present, the average hourly wage is about 20% lower than in 1931. The fall in wages has been accompanied by a great increase in the deductions for income tax, unemployment insurance, sickness insurance, etc., which have more than doubled. In 1932, these deductions amounted to between 12 and 13% of the wages. They now amount to nearly 27%, including voluntary contributions, which are voluntary only in name. According to calculations made by a very competent statistician, the net average wage of workmen employed in German industry last September was 21.65 marks a week. If agricultural workers were included, the average net wage would be much lower. The real wages or purchasing power of the German industrial workers have fallen since April rather more than the money wages, as general prices, which in the first 4 months of last year were lower than the average of 1932, have risen about 3% since April, and the price of primary necessities have risen about 10%. The average real wage in September 1933 was about 31% lower than in 1900. Quoting the Manchester Guardian Weekly, January 1934. Quoting the Times, April 10, 1934, on April 9, Dr. Ley, head of the Labor Front, declared in a speech at Cologne that the German worker, quote, to some extent was being paid starvation wages in the interest of the reconstruction of the nation, unquote, but that he must, while the state was, quote, finding bread and work for 7 million unemployed, renounce wage increases and such like things, unquote. This is already before the Labor Code, with its abrogation of all existing collective contracts, came into force on May 1, 1934. It is sufficiently clear that the economic process of fascism in Germany goes the same path as in Italy, the path of the extreme depression of the standards of the workers and intensification of exploitation. That is key. The lesson of facts in Italy and Germany should put all on their guard against the empty economic promises and programs of fascism before power in Britain and other countries.